Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video. It is already the 20th of December, but for most of you, it is still the 19th. And I am back from another hiatus. In today's video, we're going to look at a lot of important updates, beginning with the Velyka Novosilka region. We're going to work our way northeastwards towards a lot of the fighting going on south of Pokrovsk. We'll also discuss, of course, Kursk by the end of the video. The only front that really I should be mentioning that I didn't have time to get to in today's upload is Touretsk. So in my next video, I'm going to look in more detail at the unfolding battle over there, which I do think is very important. And in previous uploads over the past couple of months, I've really put an emphasis on Touretsk. So it's a shame that I wasn't able to get to it now. But the good news is that I'm going to increase the pace of uploading slightly, just because I have a bit more free time now. And probably by January, I'm going to be much more free, and then the uploads will be much more regular and steady than they have been this month, which has just been a complete mess when it comes to my schedule. But let's begin by looking here at Velyka Novosilka at some of the developments which you can see marked with yellow polygons indicating recent Russian advances. I want to zoom in and look at two areas in particular. First of all, the Makarivka, Neskuchne, Storozheve area. Really interesting what's unfolding in this region because you have a Russian maneuver to close off the village of Makarivka, which has been unfolding now for nearly a week. And according to some Russian sources, the Ukrainians have already completely withdrawn from the pocket that is formed in this village of Makarivka. If that is the case, then by the next video, I will, of course, change the map to indicate that there is no blue polygon presence over here and that the Russians have taken over the hamlets, because really it is small in size, meaning that it's extremely hard for a small squad of Ukrainian forces to defend against when all of its flanks are compromised. You can see that over here. I'll sort of visualize it for you guys because the Russians have a very clear route coming in from Staromayorsk along this road. So, a lot of Russian forces mounted on motorcycles or just going on foot from tree line to tree line, they're able to really flood in pretty quickly. Then you also had the capture of Blaudatne, at the very least, this sort of southern portion of it, taken over by the Russian side. That gave them access to the eastern bank of the Sukhi Yaly River. And ever since, the Russian infantry in this region have been using it as a springboard to cross over the river in areas that are very narrow. This is one of those areas where you see the arrow over here. And as a result, they've been able to cut off the road that's supposed to supply Storozheve and then go southwards into Makarivka. And so now it's disconnected from the wider Velyka Novosilka garrison. And so the Ukrainians, despite that fact, they really did try to resist in this area for several days. And you can imagine how difficult that is because most of the houses are completely leveled. Probably some of the basements are still are really able to be utilized, or else there would be no way for the Ukrainians to defend out in the open. But despite that fact, the Russians have really closed and tightened the noose from the north as well. You could see this is from December 17th, so 3 days ago now. It's just a small squad of Russian soldiers filmed in one of these tree lines in between Storozhove and Makarivka. Blaudatne, this is from December 4th. So 37th Motor Rifle Brigade is one of those key units operating in this area. Then to the west, here you have a really large quantity of Russian advances through an area that is relatively lightly defended when it comes to troop concentration, because a lot of the Ukrainian reinforcements or just deployment points have been either directly along the Sukhi Yaly River or eastwards in the Velyka Novosilka, or engaging in battles in Rozdonia and Novi Komar. And so the region just slightly to the west has not had the same sort of investment. It's also an area that lacks a massive density of static defenses. You could see there are two horizontal lines, but for the most part, the Russian advance was coming from Rivnopil and coming from the east, and so they didn't really encounter those static defenses during their advances. Here from December 17th, this is from the 241st Territorial Defense Brigade. You could sense the caliber of the unit that is defending in this area, but they conducted FPV strikes onto Russian tanks and infantry. The tanks were in firing positions and targeting, the nearby Ukrainian positions before withdrawing. And during that withdrawal process, those tanks and their soldiers were targeted by the FPVs. But again, when you look at reporting from the Ukrainian side, this is what they're indicating: an advance of 18 square kilometers, and it starts out just east of Rivnopil all the way to this region 5 kilometers northeastwards. That is very, very close to Storozheve, because now the Russians have really completed, for the most part, the operation in Makarivka. They're already shifting their focus northwards to other villages that could be very easily isolated due to previous Russian advances and just due to the very thin supply lines in small hamlets near rivers, you could say. And so it also provides springboard to then attack southern Velyka Novosilka. And so you could see what's going on over here with the Russian forces now only being about 2 kilometers away from the Mokry Yaly River in this particular location, from the salient just to the west of Neskuchnia and Storozove. So these two villages are very close to being cut off from one another. And of course, then there would be an impending assault on both of them. When it comes to Makarivka, you could see here from December 19th a video from the 48th Assault Battalion. It's a unit within the 123rd Territorial Defense Brigade. They just conducted FPV strikes onto Russian soldiers that had crossed over the river and entered into this agricultural warehouse, further indicating a Russian presence in the village and giving us an idea as to which units are defending in this specific area. And now, what I'm going to be interested in, and I'll update you guys about, is how many Ukrainian soldiers were actually operating here during the sort of last stand, acting as a vanguard while the rest of the Ukrainian troops withdrew, and how many of them were actually able to make it out alive and then were any POWs taken, something of that sort. But it is very important to put an emphasis and look very deeply at whenever Russia creates salients, because those are some of the best sort of maneuvers the Russians can create in order to increase Ukrainian attrition when it comes to manpower and fatigue. And so when we look at mapping and we look at villages captured or square kilometers captured, it doesn't tell the full story. But when you look at the sort of changes to the front line that create these sort of pockets of salience, that's something that indicates to us that on the ground, the Ukrainian forces within those salients and nearby, they are suffering from higher levels of attrition as a result. So that's something to look at when we sort of examine these parts of the front line. Looking a bit to the north, we can see that the Russians have re-entered Novi Komar, taken over 6.4 square kilometers of territory. They crossed over an area of about 4.2 kilometers horizontally. And then from December 5th, this is from the Shadow drone unit, they just conducted their own drone attacks. I think it's grenade drops onto individual Russian soldiers that had dismounted in the southern parts of the village. For now, the northern section appears to still be under Ukrainian control, but center and south is taken over by the Russians now. So what happened was, a couple of days ago, you had 9 infantry fighting vehicles and 1 lead tank cross over the open fields over here and then dismount around 50 troops. And they were able to disperse very quickly, too fast for the Ukrainians to, spot all of them and take them out, as they are able to do in a lot of cases when the groups are smaller. But in this case, it was just too oversaturated. And as a result, you had a lot of troops just occupy houses and basements. And so now they have a permanent position in Novi Komar, meaning the goal will be to fully solidify control over here, cut off the 00509 road, reach the Mokry Yaly River at another location, and then also sort of secure the western flank of Rozdolnia, because again, the Russians are still engaged in fighting in sort of this northern section of Rozdolnia, and now they've been able to advance slightly. And the goal will be to then look westwards at this local Ukrainian stronghold, just sort of pacify any sort of local Ukrainian positions that could be advantageous. And you look at the reinforcements moved in to ensure that the Russians cannot achieve a sort of breakthrough in this region north of Rozdolnia, because you do have this massive sort of hill that's located in an open area that is very exposed to Russian capture, which would then threaten Komar at a certain point in time. You have the 23rd Mechanized Brigade moved in. It was filmed somewhere in Rozdolnia recently, just attacking Russian positions. So just keep that in mind. It was previously located in the Chasiv Yar region, so it was moved from another important part of the front line. Now to look at the Andrivka front. Situation here is very important, and again, I would keep an eye out for it. I would put an emphasis on looking at this part of the front line going forward in the next few weeks. You can see the Russians advancing all the way to Zelenivka. Just, it's not that surprising, because in between the Sukhi Yaly River and the adjacent villages and the previous lines of contact, you had basically no Ukrainian trenches or dugouts. You had some tree lines that the Ukrainians tried sort of basing themselves in, but nothing that would ever be long term. And so then you have these examples of the Russians being able to send in large scale columns, again, utilizing a lead tank and then having behind them several infantry fighting vehicles and armored vehicles. The tank usually has a lot of armor protection and has electronic warfare systems to prevent any sort of jamming. And then they're supposed to lead the way. In a lot of cases, the entire column turns back if the lead tank gets destroyed. Not always, But in any case, you could see how they were able to traverse here 4 kilometers of just open fields. And that's something that's difficult to do in this sort of battlefield because you have the Ukrainians utilizing a wide array of drone units over here, and they have their own artillery crews. But nonetheless, on the ground, they're not seeing that much resistance in these sort of areas because there's just nowhere for the Ukrainians to operate in these specific locations. They could operate in the villages, in the hamlets, but they are just able to do so for short periods of time because, again, of the size. It's so small and it is so disconnected from the rest of the front line, especially due to the local river sort of sandwich in between where the Russians are and where the Ukrainians are on the other side. So you have here a capture of 10 square kilometers. The Russians reaching Zelenivka, taking it over in its entirety. This is from December 18th. Russian sources claim they killed 32 Ukrainian soldiers during the battle for the hamlets, captured 9, and destroyed 2 Ukrainian armored vehicles engaged in fierce fighting in this location. So what we're going to see over the next couple of days would be sort of a consolidation of all of the fields south of the Sukhi Yaly River. Now you have all of Sukhi Yaly taken over by the Russian side. So that's another village in Russian hands right now. Then looking a bit to the south, you have Konstantinopolske. There are some geolocations from this area. So the 9th Brigade, they raise a flag on a building, one of the larger ones in the western portion of the village. And here's just some earlier footage. But again, this indicates full Russian control. It's also something that's backed up by Ukrainian statements indicating that the Russians are in control of both streets and have taken over the warehouses as well. So again, one of the larger villages in the region falling into Russian hands as well. That was probably the last village besides Hihant. Hihant is, I don't even know what you would describe that as. It's just a sort of imaginary hamlet. So the Russians just have to get control over these remaining fields. Besides that, they've taken over the southern bank. You could see here they've consolidated control over the entire Uspenivka pocket, but this is probably old news to you guys because this sort of unfolded about 5 or 4 days ago. In the process, though, of taking over the entirety of the gray zone, including several paved roads, forested patches, tree lines, villages like Vesely High, Hanivka, Romanivka, Yelizavetivka, and then Uspenivka itself, they were able to capture 17 square kilometers, and then to the north, about 3 square kilometers. So you're looking at 20 square kilometers in total in this one region alone. And then you zoom in, and there were some clashes in Uspenivka because the Ukrainians did try to drag out the fighting in this region, and probably to allow some of the remnants to withdraw from the deeper areas, but also in order to just buy time for whatever Ukrainian garrisons are located in trenches a bit to the northwest, like over here, or in Yantarnia, because that is, of course, going to be the next village in the Russian purview. So here, let's look at some geolocations. December 18th, 255th Regiment. This unit has been immense when it comes to storming Ukrainian positions in these houses and engaging in close quarters combat. So here you can see their sappers. They infiltrated into the village. They threw these explosive charges into houses, destroyed them, and then stormed them afterwards. So this happened in central Uspenivka, and then here the same regiment raised their flags on the same day. Actually, December 16th, you could see the Ukrainians knocking out armored vehicles during a Russian assault coming from the south towards the Sukhi Yaly River. So again, the Ukrainians were able to repel some of the assaults, but the ground-based attacks coming in from the east were enough to take over Uspenivka in its entirety, along with this local stronghold that is based along a road that connects Kurakhove to the Uspenivka area. It was once an infamous road utilized by the Ukrainians to ensure local supply lines. Now the Russians have it under complete control. So what comes next for the Russians in this area, it would be the entire sort of strip of territory between the Sukhi Yaly River and the perimeter south of Kurakhove. It's about a 5 kilometer area when you stretch it out. And again, an area that is not that protected. So the Russians are going to have numerous opportunities to create breakthroughs utilizing armored columns, utilizing sort of this oversaturation of the battlefield to prevent the Ukrainians from being able to respond individually to each assault, and then sort of dismounting in locations of interest, which would be on Tarnia in this case, and whatever important holdings there are near the northern bank of this river. Again, the goal is also to sort of subdue the Ukrainian remnants in this pocket that is forming. You could see how a salient is already beginning to form, starting in the areas of the Starry Tyranny all the way to the western part of Kurakhove, and then sort of spanning all the way to Ulakli. So you could see we're in the process of seeing another salient being formed, with the Russians trying to squeeze it out and really push the Ukrainian front line back all the way to the eastern outskirts of Andrivka, which the Ukrainians are doing their best to prevent due to the high troop concentrations within this pocket. But again, when it comes to the defensive density, it would really be around this area in the middle, which would be sandwiched between the Kurakhove industrial zone and the open fields to the south. And I don't know how much of the Ukrainian troop garrison is actually committed to this area right now, because we're going to zoom up northwards and see that there are some very fierce battles taking place right now. So, south of the Pivdenia district, the Russians have taken over 1 square kilometer. This includes a really important tree line and the paved road. Some Ukrainian sources already claim that the Pivdenia micro district has been taken over in its entirety by Russian forces. That is certainly possible, because we did see a compilation from the 46th Air Assault Brigade of FPV strikes onto Russian holdings in this location. I think one of the geos was around here, so I already have that marked under Russian control, but I'm not sure about these several dozen other structures that may be under either a gray zone right now or soon to be Russian control. Looking a bit northwards, my map is actually sort of generous to the Ukrainian side in relation to what we're seeing come out from the Russian reporting. So Ukrainian sources did report over the past 4 or 5 days about the capture of a lot of the denser parts of Western Kurakhove, including the Citadel, these high-rise apartment buildings, local school. It's called School Number One. The city hospital, reported by Russian side, was taken over by them today, along with a lot of other buildings in this sort of western ledge, starting with the Sonechko school to the north, running all the way to the south to some of these private residential areas and nearby apartment blocks. So a lot of these areas that would have been really good positions for the Ukrainians to drag out fighting, they were simply unable to do so. Also, a lot of the structures that had the battle sort of dragged out for longer would have been destroyed. They're actually intact now, because the Russians didn't have enough time to, individually go through each building and target it and try to destroy its skeleton structure. So a lot of these houses are now going to be utilized by the Russian forces for their own sort of organizing purposes and offensive purposes in the future. So it's sort of similar to Selidova in a way, but I would say that damage here could be larger because it is a smaller city over here. So when the Russians sort of inject firepower, it's much more concentrated. So that should be kept in mind. Also, you could see the Russians took over the central part of the city. This includes some of the private residential areas and the yards separating them. To the north, you have here a denser region, including garages, local administration building taken over all along the reservoir. You could see over here, this is not relevant, but according to a lot of sources by now from the Russian side, this pocket that I have seemingly formed over here in between the axes coming from the north, from the reservoir, and from the south, from the citadel, has now been taken over in its entirety by the Russians, indicating that one of the final remaining pockets of Ukrainian resistance from the 46th Air Assault Brigade has been taken over by the Russian side. This area also in the X includes some very important, local strongholds, ATGM positions, sniper positions, whatever it may be. So now the Russians are in the process of just taking over those regions in their entirety. To the north, we know about the Russian advance along this road because of the 5th Brigade. Their sappers laid mines at this specific location. And then a Ukrainian vehicle came in to sort of relieve the Ukrainians in this particular pocket. This was on December 14th, so 6 days ago by now. And one of them was damaged and abandoned, and the other one withdrew following the incident in the encounter. So when it comes to the main Ukrainian holdings, we are all aware of them because you have a few houses on the route to the really, really important nexus of Ukrainian defense, which would be the power plant. So that's an area they're going to defend tooth and nail, because really losing it would give the Russians free access to this road passing through Dakhne. Imagine what happens after Dakhne. After Dakhne, you'd have a really chronic lack of defenses on the eastern perimeter of Andrivka, and then you just have an open road spending about 7 kilometers before you reach Andrivka, Ulakli, and the outskirts themselves. It is a very, very concerning situation. And so the Ukrainians definitely are putting in a lot of effort now to drag out the fighting and buy time in this particular district of Kurakhove. Although they would have hoped that the fighting in Kurakhove itself in the center could have sort of lasted longer, but simply due to being stretched out, the fatigue, and the Russian just mismatch when it comes to being able to storm particular locations using just combined armed supports. All of that combined, and the fact that the Russians were able to sort of isolate Ukrainian forces here into sort of segments, and then storm those locations individually, like Pivdenia, like this pocket over here. And, all of that compounded because obviously the battle in Kurakhove is not occurring in isolation. You also have so many other areas where the Ukrainians need to pay attention to. That's what led to the Russians succeeding in this location. Looking a bit to the north, here you're seeing some other Russian advances taking over this sort of vertical span of the rail line. That's zero point 0.6 square kilometers. The western portion of Somsivka, that's 1.27 square kilometers. Just west of Zoria, capturing another zero point 0.7 square kilometers. Again, the Russians just chipping away at some of the local gullies and fields on the way to Petropavlivka and Slavyanka, where you do have Ukrainian reinforcements currently building up, trying to create a tentative line of defense. And the goal would be to prevent this sort of Russian hook coming in from the north to assault and put pressure onto the northern flank of Andrivka. So that's the entire idea. And you can see there is a large density of Ukrainian troops, not necessarily static defenses in this area. So it could still be an area the Russians end up exploiting in the future. But where they've actually succeeded in really yielding a lot of spoils would be in this area south of Novotroitska. Here you can see the Russians capturing 29 square kilometers, taking over the entirety of Pushkin after some fierce clashes. Here you can see December 15th, Javelin ATGM hit a Russian tank on the road to Ukrainka. So Ukrainka is still under Ukrainian control, but the Russians do have access to the road leading to its eastern entrance, and then also they are advancing along this highway that advances southwards towards the western entrance to Ukrainka. So Ukrainka is important because it acts as sort of a vanguard and entrance point to two lines of Ukrainian villages. Because from Ukrainka, you could then sort of jump forward and get to an assortment of what is this 5 villages, and then from there the final 3 villages before you reach the border between Donetsk and Dnipro. So this is a very critical area. These villages are so important because losing them would give the Russians free access to the entire span of open fields, just huge swaths of land that are unprotected and could be combed through in a rapid pace by Russian forces that have experience doing similar things west of the Vavch River. So really, that this would be able to undermine Ukrainian defenses, not just in Andrivka, but in everything west of it, along the same chain of villages like Oleksivka, Zelenikut. So it's so important for the Ukrainians to ensure that their defenses in this area are rock solid. And it's not just for this chain of villages, but also for the one to the north. That includes Nova Olenivka, which the Russians are now in the process of storming. The Russians advanced a total of, let's see, I want to see here, about 6 kilometers southwards to make it to Nova Olenivka, and did so from Novotroitska. Now gives them access to this trench line over here, to this entire valley running through Novozhely, Zavetivka, Nadivka, Kotlyarivka. Again, after that, there's not much left. It's large swaths of open fields, and then you get access to the border between Dnipro and Donetsk and the Solona River Valley. So it is a very concerning situation over here, and I would assume that the Ukrainians are going to look at sending in a few units to patch in this area because we've seen troop rotations a bit to the north to deal with the situation south of Pokrovsk, and that's completely warranted. But I also believe that the Ukrainians need to do something similar with this area just west and south of Novotroitska. When it comes to geolocations from this area, you have the 59th Brigade. They're one of the key units now involved in the defense. So they conducted FPV strikes onto infantry and tree lines south of Zhovte. Then looking at the fighting in the Novotroitsk area, you have here from December 17th, a Russian soldier that was advancing along just out in the open on his own. He was killed by the 425th Skala Assault Battalion near Novovasilivka. So that indicates to us where the Russians are present, which is just adjacent to the river. And then the Ukrainians are still trying to hold on to this Novovasilivka village. The Russians are definitely going to use Novotroitsk as a linchpin to expand in all directions. They've already done so when it comes to Shevchenko, and they could do so going northwards once they cross over the narrow portions of the Solona River towards Vovkove and Pischane. And then, of course, as we just saw right now with Novovasilivka, it's a 5 square kilometer advance. And from the village itself, it's about a gain of 2.5 kilometers westwards. Looking at the fields north of Novopustinka, again, a great area for the Russians to consolidate advances after 5 days of fierce clashes and back and forth. The Ukrainians conducting at some point localized counterattacks south of Pishane, but now the Russians have been able to advance 2.7 kilometers northwards and are on the outskirts of Pishane, another very important village because it is at the precipice of a line of villages that are very sort of tied into one another, leading all the way to the sort of southwestern portion of Pokrovsk. So you go from Pischane, and then it directly leads into Zvirove and Leontovici, and then to Troyanda, and then you reach the mine in southwestern Pokrovsk, and you're already in the heart of the city. So it really follows from one to another. There aren't any buffers in between. I suppose there are some trenches, but not a lot of space in between. So it's very important for the first line of villages not to fall, which would include Pischane, and that's why you have the 155th Mechanized Brigade defending in this location. Looking a bit to the east, this is where you see the heavy fighting moving past Shevchenko because the Russians have been able to take it over. And I said, as a litmus test, because the Russians were very quickly taking over villages west of Selidove. If the Russians were able to capture Novotroitsk and Shevchenko in similar fashion, even in the face of reinforcements coming in or counterattacks, then it would indicate the Russian garrison here is not fatigued. The Russians do still have very strong momentum and can continue an offensive in this location and take over medium-sized villages, which would be what's necessary in order to reach the outskirts of Pokrovsk. And we're seeing that manifest in real time. The Russians have very, very clear routes to reach the city itself, and they have areas that are would be infiltration points that the Ukrainians now have to send reinforcements towards in order to ensure that the breakthrough does not happen faster than is imagined. Right now, the Russians are only about 2.5 kilometers away from the southern outskirts and about, say, 4.5 kilometers away from the heartland of Pokrovsk. So it is now a very, very close situation, and you can see that the density of trenches over here is just not enough. It is not enough when you see the intensity of the Russian assaults and where they're pushing through. You can zoom in over here and see that past Shevchenko, there are a few geolocations. So first of all, in Vidrozhenia, this is from, let's see, December 18th. And it's just a video of grenade drops onto Russian soldiers advancing on foot along the rail line. And the village is also called Novi Trud. It's one of the other. And you could see how at the same time you have this advance coming in from the Chenske. So those concurrent gains do put Zelenya in a difficult position because it's being involved from both sides. And following the fall of Zelenya, you could say there are a few other local trenches in this region, but then you just have open access to the rail line. The Russians do love advancing through those areas because of the concealment it provides for larger platoon-sized squad groupings. So that could be utilized in a future attack. And so you have this route that leads directly into the Shakhtarsky district and the entrance to Pokrovsk. So definitely something to keep an eye out for in the future. But the Ukrainians have moved in reinforcements. You could just see some of them on my map, and I will be adding some more as the situation develops. Looking a bit to the east, or rather the Kharkiv front, you can see that there are large-scale Russian gains here as well. Also in areas that are between the line of contact and Ukrainian large-scale lines of defense. So the hinterlands the Ukrainians simply can't afford to hold on to. They're unable to in the medium term. And you could see that over here with the yellow polygons that I've marked, indicating the Russians capturing 42 square kilometers within about a week in just this one part of the front line. So it's a pretty large amount when you look at it. But then you zoom in and you see the sort of territory captured, and it is largely just gullies and not many trenches in between them, and then the fields that you need in order to go from one gully to the other. So you can see Lozova, for instance, it's being enveloped because it's the one location where there actually could be a stable Ukrainian presence. So the Russians just avoided it. And now they've created this sort of an envelopment situation that will squeeze out the Ukrainians in the future, giving the Russians access to a frontline village that could then be used to push forward along new valleys all the way into areas like Zakhrizhove, Bohuslavka, and Novokrukhlyakivka. And these are just three villages that are very important in this specific area because they're the final villages in the buffer zone before you reach the actual line of defense, second to last line of defense. That is guarding the Oskil River bridgehead for the Ukrainians, because you have this one line over here, which is clearly fleshed out, and then you have one just around the perimeter of Borova. So the Russians are just making good use of their offensive capacity here and chipping away at Ukrainian targets one by one. And you could see how that is also helping them secure the entire salient that is now adjacent to the Oskil River. The Russian forces originally had a very narrow sort of salient around Pischane, but you can see how it has blossomed and expanded, and now it is sort of ironclad and continuing to branch out in several directions. But there are some reports that the Ukrainians have been able to conduct localized counterattacks and retake Kolesnikivka. So keep an eye out for that. I'm going to look into more detail to see if that's actually the case. But regardless, you could see that the south of the Russians have had a lot of success over the past week. Another area that is absolutely critical to keep an eye out for would be the area west of the Oskil River. So we all know about the Russians crossing over into Novoblinsk because that happened a couple of weeks ago. The Ukrainians were able to quell that bridgehead, but ever since the Russians have been expanding west of Masyivtivka, and they've sort of used it as a conduit across the river, also utilizing the Monpershki and Horopivka. There are a few other villages in this region that are good supply nodes for that effort. So initially, the Russians just had 3 square kilometers, but ever since the past week, they've been able to expand southwards towards Novi, so that's about 2 square kilometers. They're also very close to the P79 highway connecting the Vorichna to the western part of Kupiansk, and they're pretty close to Zapadny as well. The Russians here are making use of small squads, very small squads, but then at night, moving equipment across and trying to build up the foothold step by step, and entering into these sort of locations with forested regions, entrenching themselves there, looking northwards. You could also see the Russians entering into the southern Novorochna itself. That's based on geolocation from December 18th of just grenade drops onto those locations. And so it's going to be absolutely essential for the Ukrainians to quell these bridgeheads in their nascent stage, because if you don't, then eventually they're going to compound in size and strength and threaten local Ukrainian positions on the rear. Most obviously, the Dvorichna, but then you sort of go into the depth over here and you could see how it could threaten the entirety of Western Kupiansk in the future. So the Russians really are testing the waters here to see if this could be a sort of avenue they use in the future once, situation worsens for the Ukrainians east of the Oskil River, and then they could sort of just go hand in hand with whatever advances the Russians are, engaging in eastern Kupiansk, and then you have this sort of northern attack coming in from the western, sort of like northwestern flank, putting a lot of pressure onto the other half of the city. So that's something the Russians are really looking at intently, and the Ukrainians should be taking seriously. But now let's move on to Kursk, the final parts of today's video. I'm just going to very quickly address some of the claims from the Ukrainian side of where they are claiming North Koreans are engaged in fighting. I'll also click on all the videos, and you can click on them on my map as well to get an idea for yourself. And then, it's sort of up to you at this point, because I still am of the belief that there is not enough definitive proof of North Korean soldiers engaged in fighting in the Kursk region. Because over the past couple of days, we've actually received some close ups of what are claimed to be dead North Korean soldiers. But again, the issue is, and it's just so easy that it could be, not distinguished correctly from Buryats or from so many other ethnic groups in eastern Russia, in the Siberia region, that are either of sort of Turkic or Mongolian descent, those sort of tribes. And the best way to tell if there actually are North Korean soldiers would be if the Ukrainians were able to get a POW, or get a KIA, and then have an ID or interview them, and they speak a North Korean dialect, so a North Korean dialect of Korean, and then that would be a good way to definitively tell. But interestingly, Romanov, so pro-Russian source, but they're not the most reliable, they claimed that on December 6th, a group of North Korean special forces were involved in capturing Plakhovo. But for a while now, we've known about Plakhovo being captured, and it didn't happen in a singular day like Romanov was claiming. But either way, just I'm throwing it out there because there have been recently some rumors from the pro-Russian side of North Koreans actually being involved. Again, we do still have to wait because it is a very, very significant claim. But looking at the actual locations west of Plakhovo, there definitely are Russian upticks in offensive activity. So December 15th, you have a Russian infantry platoon attacking west of Plakhovo. Again, large size. When I say platoon, we're talking about 40 plus men. And In this particular video and in many others where you see platoons moving around, they're not actually engaged in combat at the very moment when they're being recorded, either by the Russian or Ukrainian side. But they are moving around in an orderly fashion through open fields into forested regions, and maybe then they disperse and begin to fight when they reach the areas that are actually at the line of contact. But we're not actually seeing them run up in, a group of 40 and attack a Ukrainian position. That's not something that I actually saw. Looking a bit to the north, you could see your geolocation. This one is not relevant, but east of Kirilovka, this is from December 14th, 61st Mechanized Brigade interestingly moved away from the Luhansk front to defend in Kursk. They conducted grenade drops onto Russian forces that were crossing over the Psal River and actually succeeded in doing so. You have a river crossing over here where it's relatively narrow, and we're able to reach the other river, the Reka Suja, and very, very close to this village over here. In the process, they also took 2 Russian POWs. But this shows us that for the most part, the Russians have been able to expel the Ukrainians across the Psal River and are now making preparations for, taking over the entire southern flank of Suja. So this is a very important area to keep an eye out for in the future. Another area where there has been intensification of Russian attacks would be near Naidenov, and you could see the gains here amounting to nearly 7 square kilometers. There are a few videos. One of them is infamous by now, of the dozens of Russian infantry crossing an open field towards this wooded area over here on December 15th. Again, they're not engaging in offensive or I wouldn't say if they are definitely engaging in offensive activities, because they're advancing through an area that would nominally be a part of the gray zone, but they're not actually shooting at Ukrainian forces at the very moment when the video is recorded. So you can't say the entire group is fighting it as one unit during like clashes, because we don't know if they disperse afterwards, which would just be logical because you're looking at such a large concentration, which could be targeted by drones or artillery. But in any case, it's still interesting to see that they're not using vehicles at the front line. Interestingly, also, Russian vehicle losses, damage, destroyed, etc., have really returned to lower rates than they have throughout the entirety of 2024. They're back to the rates that they were in 2023. That's because the Russians have reduced their reliance on vehicles near the line of contact for the movement of some infantry. A lot of it is being done on foot, or instead of using armored vehicles or, infantry vehicles or tanks for moving around troops, they're utilizing buggies or motorcycles and the like. And so that's played a role and a factor in reducing those losses, despite the fact that the Russians are still, of course, conducting very large amounts of assaults on a daily basis. Actually, probably some of the largest that they have throughout the entire course of the war, according to Ukrainian reporting. Is just that whenever it's not extremely necessary, they're not going to risk the vehicular losses that come with, stationing those sort of targets very close to the front line for movement of troops. Here you can see east of Naidenov, another video. This is from the 95th Air Assault Brigade. They conducted FEV strikes onto infantry that were advancing through open fields, taking over positions near the village of Naidenov itself. They claim that they were able to hit North Korean infantry, but again, something that has not been verified. Looking a bit to the west, this is an area the Russians are really looking at intently. They tried to assault Pogrebki head on. It did not succeed. They tried assaulting from this rail line to the east. It did not succeed either. So now the Russians are pushing from the Naidenov region and also from Krugelenkoy in order to create a situation where they're encircling and then putting pressure on the flanks of the Ukrainian garrison here that is very strong and includes the 47th Mechanized Brigade, for instance, and several other units that you can see marked here as air assault forces, territorial defense forces. There's heavy mechanized brigades that are fighting here. To zoom in for you guys, you can see that the main Russian push is coming from the Krulenkoy region. It amounts to 25 square kilometers. There are, I believe, 4 separate videos of platoons moving through open fields in the northern section of this yellow polygon. They may be the same platoon squad, or maybe there were several of them, and they're coming either from the 22nd Motor Rifle Regiment or the 810th Naval Infantry Brigade. And according to Ukrainian sources, North Korean soldiers are attached to both of these units, and they're involved in the platoon assaults that are occurring, pushing further eastwards towards forested regions, and eventually with the goal of taking Krugelenkoy and, sort of choking and squeezing out whatever Ukrainian forces are from Pogrebki all the way south to Malaya Luknaya. That's what Ukrainians are alleging, of course. Here you can see that the gains would span nearly 5 kilometers southeastwards and reach all the way to Krugelenkoy. This is from December 16th. It's a video of the Ukrainians filming 4 mortally wounded or killed North Korean soldiers. That's what they claim, of course. in the forest near Kulinkoi. Again, Asian looking, but of course, there's always going to be a sort of doubt, seed of doubt, due to them potentially being Buryats, Tuvans, Almatais, so many other tribes that could be mentioned. And I'm not enough of an expert to distinguish between, their physiognomies, especially from afar in a lot of the videos. But actually, in this case, it was pretty close in good resolution. Also, the 8th Special Purpose Regiment published their own video of a killed, what they claim to be North Korean soldier. So hopefully there's further analysis of that photo, but they claim that it actually was a killed one, and they obviously got the photo of it. But also just remember that the Buryats and many other of these far east Russian soldiers, they enlist at higher rates than ethnic Russians in a lot of cases. A lot of people coming in from the Siberian Oblast, they come in at higher rates per capita than the regions that are located in Western Russia, where you have more ethnic Russians. So it's just not that rare of a sighting to see Asian Russians fighting in these locations over here. It never really has been, especially in some of the naval infantry brigades or in air assault brigades. It is common in a lot of cases. Looking a bit to the north, there are a few other geolocations here that are of note. I want to see which one is important to mention. Here you have 23 Russian soldiers that were lined up, probably for pickup and disposal. 3 Russian soldiers that were, of course, killed in action. They were just lined up in a sort of just row together. So it was filmed then by a drone. And it was claimed by some sources that it was North Koreans, but again, no verification of that. Here you can see 1st Battalion of the 22nd Mechanized Brigade. It was recently re-engaged in this area and is involved in the defense in Kursk. So they conducted FPV strikes onto Russian soldiers hiding in tree lines north of Novo Ivanovka. Here you can see that the Russians were able to take over Novo Ivanovka in its entirety. So the 155th Marine Brigade, they were able to raise their flag atop a tank located in the eastern part of the village, and they also cleared out some of the nearby trenches. So it is an important victory because they were able to push out the 47th Brigade, and now the goal will be to take over Leonidovo and Alexandria, because then, following the loss of those villages, the Russians would only be about, about 4 kilometers away from the chain of villages that they're really looking keenly at squeezing out. So that's all for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.